This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land.
Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied, Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said. I'm Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. In this podcast, How Did We Get Here?, I hope to provide background and context to understand better a big story in the news. Well, there is only one story right now, and I'm going to be talking about the massive threat to the UK economy that's posed by the coronavirus. This week I'm talking to one of the most respected economists in the country, Dr Gerard Lyons. He's Chief Economic Strategist with NetWealth, and he was the Chief Economic Advisor to Boris Johnson when the Prime Minister was Mayor of London. So does the UK have the right strategy? Can we get through this? And is Boris Johnson the man to lead that fight? I spoke down the line to Gerard Lyons at his house in Kent. Thanks very much for joining us for this edition of How Did We Get Here? How are you doing, first of all? All well?
Very well, thank you.
Good.
And great to be on this programme.
So first of all, the government's big economic response to what is an extraordinary economic challenge as well now. Are they getting it right?
Well, I think the government has done some things very well, but I think there is far more that still needs to be done. I thought the budget was good. The subsequent policy announcement by the Chancellor also had some successes in it. But I think the reality is that there is still a lot more that needs to be done. To put this in perspective, the UK, like many other economies in the West, faces both a health crisis and an economic stroke financial crisis. To be confident about the outlook, we need to be past the worst, or at least expect to be past the worst on the health side. But it's quite clear that as the health crisis has continued, it's hit the economy very hard indeed. Therefore, it's necessary to have intervention. We've seen some of that, but I think the government needs to do even more.
Okay, so what sort of things do they need to do?
Well, to put this in perspective, one needs to think of where the economy is, not just here in the UK, but in Western Europe and in the States. And for listeners, think of the letters LUV in terms of the shape of the economy. When this crisis initially hit in China and Asia, it looked like there would be a V-shaped economic impact, down for 1 or 2 quarters, and then a relatively quick recovery. And that's what the markets were anticipating maybe only 4 weeks ago. And indeed, Asia is past the worst. But in the last few weeks, as the crisis has become global, the expectation is that it will be a global recession, a U-shape. But the danger we now face is that global recession may not actually capture what could hit us. And it might well be an L-shaped economic impact over the next year or two, where the economy falls off the edge of a cliff because the supply side shock has now transmitted into a demand side shock where people are not able to spend, companies not investing, and employment is falling and unemployment is set to rise sharply.
Is there anything we can do about that, though, as long as we don't feel we've got to the end of the medical side of this?
Well, the medical side is on one track, and what the government has focused on is providing money to the NHS. That clearly makes sense. It's talked about providing help to firms, help to individuals, and then there's the whole financial agenda in terms of the money markets and financial markets. I think a whole host of things need to be done even more. In terms of small firms, the initial borrowing that the Chancellor announced last week of 330 billion, or the other day of 330 billion pounds, 15% of GDP, is very impressive indeed. But it now appears when one goes into the detail, there's too many strings attached, too many hurdles to be passed, and it's available largely to so-called investment grade firms. More funding needs to be made available to small firms across the board. So that more needs to be done immediately in terms of the corporate sector. I think a lot needs to be done in terms of individuals as well. In the budget, the Chancellor announced easier access to statutory sick pay and to other types of facilities called ESA and universal credit. But these are very small in scope. And also the reality is that many people are not going to be receiving the paycheck over the next few months. I personally think the UK should adopt the approach that the Americans are following, which is to actually provide income to everyone in the country. It might sound like a large and expensive thing to do, but the scale of the hit to the economy and to the budget deficit as a result of what we're seeing will be significant. But when I've looked at the cost of this, it is manageable.
Okay, so can I just because this is quite an unusual concept for people. So the idea is the government would basically just say, don't worry, all a huge chunk of the workforce, maybe all the workforce, we're going to write you a cheque. Just like that. Is that the way it works?
Well, to put this, yes is the answer to that. To put this in perspective, the Chancellor talked about the policy proposal being the 3 T's: targeted, temporary, and timely. The other T I would add to that is Titanic. It needs to be very sizable. Now, ideally, you do want to target the funds to those most in need, but that naturally comes with a significant time aspect to it. Lots of rules, regulations, constraints. What we're seeing in America is a decision has been taken this week to actually provide a check basically to everyone immediately. The reason you're doing it to everyone in the States is because at least that gives you the speed, and obviously there's a scale aspect. What we have done here in the UK is welcome so far, in that the Chancellor and the government is trying to minimise people's outgoings in the next few months with a mortgage holiday and other such reliefs. What we additionally need to see is money being put in people's pockets to substitute for the fact they may no longer be working for the next few months, and therefore they may no longer have access to funds for the next few months.
I mean, this sounds obviously extraordinarily expensive. Are we just saying the normal rules have been thrown up in the air?
Well, it's not normal rules being thrown up in the air. We face a crisis, and one could call it an economic war. And indeed, the Prime Minister himself has used the phrase war. To put this in perspective, Andy, the UK has faced 3 wars in the last 200 years. And if one looks at debt to GDP in those wars, in the Napoleonic War, debt to GDP rose to 150%. In the First World War, it went from about 20% to 110%. And in the Second World War, from 130% to about 250%. Naturally, in wars, the government borrows. So I think we also need to see a monetary and financial response to reflect what's happening in the financial markets, and also the need to provide liquidity and confidence to firms of all shapes and sizes across the country.
But in terms of a monetary response, we've already cut the interest rates. There's been an emergency interest rate cut. Can they go any further?
Yes, I think the UK authorities, the Bank of England needs to be seen in the context of the whole of government approach. But in answer to your question, yes, I would be quite radical. I would cut interest rates to 0. And on top of that, I would actually take the view, this is a great time to start investing longer term in the UK. Even though the UK economy has been hit very hard by this, there are many aspects of the economy that are very sound. I do think going into this crisis, we had a very imbalanced economy with some good parts, world-class parts, also some difficult areas, hence the need to level up. It might be a time to think about, as in Japan again, using the Bank of England or using the authorities generally to start to invest in UK funds.
I just want to jump in there, Gerard, because I mean, you're saying it's a good time to invest in the UK. It doesn't feel like that the rest of the world is taking that view right now, especially the way they're piling out of sterling.
Yeah, one of the challenges globally at the moment is that when you have a financial crisis, you have the first wave where markets react to the crisis, and then you have the second wave, which can often be difficult to predict in advance, but is often a liquidity issue. Funds across the globe are forced to sell assets that are liquid in order to raise cash. Now, one of the benefits of the UK economy over the years has been that it's a global economy, it's a very open economy, and its markets are very deep. In the good times, that makes the UK very attractive. But in times like this, it means the UK might be one of the places where international investors seek to raise funds from, because even though this hit is very hard, it will be temporary and the UK economy will bounce back. And therefore, it's very beholden upon the authorities to be ahead of the curve to make sure that the temporary hit does not become a permanent hit. Hence the interventionist strategy that I'm talking about. And the interventionist strategy is being followed in some respects across economies across the world at the moment.
So who's doing the best job, you think, in terms of that interventionist strategy?
Well, I think, first and foremost, when one looks at what's happened in this crisis, Asia has contained the health fallout. And indeed, that's why markets were so shocked maybe 4 weeks ago when the announcement was made from Italy on the Sunday, because it had been seen as being a health issue that was largely contained. So on the health side, one can put that to one side, and now having full quarantine across Western Europe, I think will limit the extent of this health aspect. On the financial side, I think across Asia, Hong Kong and Singapore have provided targeted funds. Last week, the Japanese intervened in the markets to stabilize the markets. I think the Europeans, in terms of the European Central Bank, mismanaged expectations last week and fell behind the curve, and they're having to catch up. America seems to, like the UK, have sort of been slow off the mark, but now taking action. I thought the UK did well in terms of the comprehensive nature of the policy at the time of the budget, but the scale of events since then means that we need to be doing even more.
I mean, a lot of people have said what the UK needed to do, a bit like what Gordon Brown kind of did in 2008, was to say, we will stand behind everything. You know, whether it's businesses that are worried about going down, whether it's people who are worried about losing their homes, that the UK would stand behind as guarantor on all of the economy. Do you feel that has happened yet here in this crisis?
I think it's work in motion, and I think we should be taking that approach. In terms of individuals, as I touched on, I think we need to be radical, and it's very much in terms of providing assistance that's needed, but it will be short-lived. In terms of the business sector, it's not just about looking after the big firms, they're naturally important, but safeguarding the whole swathe of small and medium-sized firms. And in terms of other aspects of the financial sector, as I touched on, is about not only ensuring liquidity, but ensuring confidence about the future and intervening where necessary. I think against that backdrop, it would be a positive outcome. We have to remember here that while we have had pandemics before, they've not become, for some time, global as this current pandemic has. So the interventions need to be at a national level. But also one thing that comes out of this is how the G20 needs to resolve itself. A few weeks ago, the G20 met in Saudi Arabia. That Sunday evening, I was very critical of their response, and I was surprised that others had not been critical. I think one thing that comes out of this, in my personal opinion, is the need for a G20 secretariat rather than passing it from one country to another country. And I would actually argue that a global economy like the UK should actually be the host of that secretariat. But I think these are longer term issues that need to come out of this. But certainly, if one goes back to 2008-09, as you touched on with Prime Minister Brown, we had countries responding. We also then had President Bush convening the G20 meeting at the time of the IMF in Washington. I remember being there in that October 2008. And then Gordon Brown convened the London Summit, I think in April 2009. So a global response is necessary. Maybe people are focusing more at the global response on the health side now, just as the focus back in 08-09 was a global response on the financial side. But certainly, whatever happens on that front, on the global perspective, the UK needs to build on the successes to date and do more on the health front, on the economic financial front, and on the communication front. I'm confident that we will, and that while this hit to the economy will be significant, it will be temporary, that is, over the next few months, and that provided we take the assistance required or give the assistance required, the economy will rebound.
Okay, two quick questions. One, we're supposed to be leaving the EU definitively, well, we've left, but on January the 1st, whatever happens. Do you think that's a timetable that should be changing now?
No. Obviously, this is a health and economic issue that takes precedence. I'm obviously not privy to what's going on behind the scenes.
Don't you think we need a bit more time with all this crisis going on to negotiate a proper, future relationship?
Well, we need to have a proper future relationship, and that future relationship must not tie our hands on domestic issues or on global issues. But of course, it's the secondary issue at the moment. So obviously, if it needs to be delayed, it obviously that should be a sensible decision that needs to be taken. But one would expect the EU and the UK have a sensible future relationship. And the question is whether the timetable allows that before the end of the year.
Okay, but if necessary, would you be ready to see it pushed back a bit?
Well, I think it's the secondary issue, but yeah, pushback if it's needed. As things stand at the moment, that should not be the main focus. But yeah, if a push is needed, of course.
Okay, and finally, Boris Johnson, you've worked with him a lot in the past. Do you think he's the right man to be in position right now to be dealing with such a crisis?
Well, I think the Prime Minister clearly was good Mayor of London when I worked with him. What he needs to be doing at the moment is really making sure he's on top of the health, the economic, financial, and the communication issues. I think it's good that we're having this daily communication now to actually make sure that people understand the context and that the communication strategy is clear and straightforward. And then it's about executing that. Clearly, the quarantining is working. And I think, as I've indicated here, on the economic and financial front, we've done a lot, but I think we can do even more. And I expect the Prime Minister to be able to clearly communicate that as well.
Gerard Lyons, thanks very much for talking to us for this edition of How Did We Get Here? Really appreciate it. Sorry, we've got to talk down the line, but that is just the way things are right now. But I really appreciate talking to you. Thanks a lot.
Great. Pleasure to talk to you as well. Thank you.
Dr. Gerard Lyons. If you have any idea on this or for any other podcast, please email me on andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting on @AndyBell5News. Thank you for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? Wishing everyone out there all the very best right now, and despite all that's happening, there will be another edition along soon.